You had me at Cello, Cello. You had me at Cello. You had me at Cello. Oh, you had me at Cello.
Hi, everybody. 5 o'clock on a Friday. I sure hope you've been finding the various resources that You Had Me at Cello useful, and all the other wonderful things you can find related to cello practicing, cello playing online. And now we're going to add to that. You're going to have some more resources from Elaine Colprit. Professor Colprit is my guest this evening. How are you doing today?
Doing very well.
Terrific. It's always great to talk to you, and I'm very much looking forward to this.
I am too. It's rare that I have the time to really sit down and talk with a colleague from across the country. And yeah, it's fun to do that and to imagine our audience too as potential participants in the future.
Excellent. Well, let's start with your musical background. What drew you to music or cello in the first place, and how did that evolve to where you are today?
Well, I grew up in a family that listened to music quite a bit, and I was in piano lessons when I was at 6, and I began in public school instruction when I was 10, and I decided to play the cello. The teacher recruited me for violin, but I didn't want anything that played that high, that close to my head. So I opted for the cello, and which of course grew in size as I grew, and I finally clued into the fact that I was going to have to be carrying this large thing around for the rest of my life. So that led to participation in high school and eventually going to Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois for music education in strings. And I worked as a string teacher in South Carolina, Charleston, and in Winston-Salem, North Carolina for a total of about 8 years. And then went back to school at the Cleveland Institute of Music and got a degree there. My teacher was Alan Harris, and worked with him happily for 2.5 years. And from there, came back, had a private studio, and did some teaching in community music schools. As a result, I'm a real proponent of community music schools. I think they're lovely, creative places to have within a community. And after that, I went to the University of Texas at Austin for a PhD. I knew nothing about what the PhD would yield for me, but I felt like there was more I needed to know. And there was much, much, much more. And that's what you learn, of course, in getting an advanced degree, is how much you don't know. And to this day, I'm grateful to that degree for letting me know that. And then I landed at Bowling Green State University, and I've been there teaching the string techniques class, as well as some graduate courses, one in music cognition and the other in directed research. So that's pretty much a lifespan right there.
All right. Now let's see, you went music education, music performance, music education. Is that right?
That's right.
I think that's not necessarily typical. What was it that kind of made you go from the one to the other and back to the one?
I love the instrument, and I felt like I needed to be better at the instrument to be better in the classroom.
All right.
And so I went to the instrument. And as you know, I continued to study the instrument for at least one of my years at the University of Texas as well. So I got to study with Phyllis Young as well.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. How would you compare Harris's and Young's teaching approaches, teaching styles?
Mr. Harris is very analytical physically of what you're doing, which was very, very helpful. To help change some inefficiencies in what I was doing. With Mrs. Young, in contrast to Alan Harris, she taught mainly through imagery, but she also had a very well-grounded imagination of sound, regarding sound, and communicated that well. So actually my work with Mr. Harris and my work with Mrs. Young were quite compatible. I just needed to be able to take in the information and reach back to when I was at CIM and be able to apply those techniques to get what Mrs. Young wanted me to do.
Outstanding.
So, yeah.
Now you have quite a bit of research that I find very interesting, and I think that a lot of the viewers would find interesting as well. And I'd love to know, I mean, there's always a story as to how particular unanswered questions in life drew a researcher towards them. So can you kind of walk us through how your research interests became what they became, and then tell us some of how you go about studying the approaches to teaching Suzuki and things like that?
Fortunately, the PhD degree, in order to be accepted into a program, requires that you teach. So I'm going to go back to that. After I taught for several years, I had lots of questions as to why some things worked and why they didn't work. And I knew I had to revamp what I was doing in my teaching, but I didn't have really a guiding light for that. What the research degree teaches you is how to come up with better questions. You have some answers along the way, and you also understand that those answers spawn new questions, and it continues. And so it's a lifelong educational path that you travel. My interest in the learning process really was ignited when I was in the PhD program. It really, as I realized, and I was reading research, and some of the things they were saying was shedding light for me onto some situations I had experienced with my students. So that kind of set me up that when the time came for me to write out the questions I had that potentially could become dissertation questions, that they tended to focus on teaching, on the whys of teaching and learning and the learning process itself. And once you get into that, then you've got to get into the backstory. And that takes you back into how humans learn. And there had been advances in neuroimaging, what we do with that information, and understanding how the learning process has exposed itself to us as it's been studied over time. So that's how I got into doing an observation of Suzuki string teaching, which was interesting and actually spawned, as I indicated earlier, new questions. So if I do research, it's observational for the most part, or it's informational in trying to find more information to help me make decisions about what I'm doing in the classroom.
All right. So I'm curious. So, for example, what do you, as a performer, also think are the top few most surprising or most interesting things that you've uncovered in your research that a lot of performers don't know?
Well, one of the things that I saw in the observation of Suzuki string teaching, and this wasn't something I set out to look at, but once you make parameters on your observations, then things pop out that need to be addressed, and this was one of them. I noticed that teachers changed their language, the way they expressed their directives to students as they got older. There's a certain point where they no longer talk about the physical action required to create a crescendo. They just ask for a crescendo. Mm-hmm. And that changes the experience for the student. And now, because now the student has to hear the word crescendo and understand it, and then make a link to the physical actions they need to make happen in order to create that, and the timing that they of those actions as it creates the crescendo. It sounds like a small thing, but I wondered if we're actually doing that intentionally, or is it because we're looking at a larger, more advanced student and making an assumption? In my own teaching, I've found out the word assumption has got me in a lot of trouble, and I'll be quite disappointed in my students. And then I look at the task I have asked of them and counted all the assumptions that I made. So that's one thing, is that I'm very careful about separating musical outcome from the physical aspects of it takes the motor skills it takes to perform it.
All right. Well, okay, now I've got another question. You've presented on your findings quite extensively. Do you find that there's any relationship between the skills that it takes to be an effective speaker, a public speaker, and musical performance anxiety? You know what I mean? So as you have spoken more widely over the years at a variety of places, you've probably advanced in the same way that somebody, as they perform in different venues, they get more comfortable with the idea of performing. Do you see any correlations between what you can learn in your comfort level of presenting research with your comfort level on stage?
That's an interesting question, because they both involved organization of thinking. And for me, organization of my thinking on the cello has come late. I would have welcomed it much earlier. But I think I was operating under the notion that I should be doing what other people were asking me to do, which I should be able to do what they asked me to do, but not engaging in that process of creating new goals for myself, and not monitoring what I was doing and how I was creating what was asked of me. And I think once I accepted that, I became more like the thinker I need to be when presenting.
I like that. Go ahead.
Yeah, is to take outside information, which you do when you're presenting, and make it your own, and then do something with it. And that's the engagement I need on the cello. I need to be responsible with that. And I can remember when I was at the Cleveland Institute, I asked what turned out to be a very naive question. And I realized it the minute I asked it. I asked in a group class, what am I supposed to be thinking about when I'm performing? And that was, now I understand that revealed a lot about me. And this vacancy I had in really preparing in a way that I could think about my technique as I was performing and look forward to certain events.
Well, I do like when you said the organizing of one's thoughts. That says a lot. And I like how, for example, if whether one's speaking or performing, if you're always anticipating, where am I going with this? What's coming next?
Yeah.
And then also the intentionality of, I'm not letting things happen haphazardly. I'm in the driver's seat as to the direction. I like that.
And you're busy. You can't. I'm just busy now. You can't take my attention away from this, because I have things I'm looking forward to, because I got to get ready for the next event.
Right. I like that.
Yeah.
Now, let's see. One of the things I definitely am sure to ask everybody is about this idea of motivation. It's just the running theme more than anything of these interviews. And as you know, there's X number of people in the world who think it would be really cool to be good at a musical instrument, for example. And then there's a smaller number that actually do put in the work, the effort, the mental practice, just the time to get there. So what are some of your thoughts on this topic of motivation to play and to practice and to advance as a musician?
Yeah, I'm always working on that in my teaching and for myself. I have to say, I have to agree with one of my cello teachers was Robert Marsh, and he taught at the North Carolina School of the Arts for several years, and I was able to study with him when I was in Winston-Salem. And so he would lead with saying the hardest thing you're going to do is sit down and get behind the cello. And some days that is true. And some days you just have to sit down and do it. But the reward is so great when you do it. I mean, it's just so wonderful. Not that you play everything really well right off, but it just feels so good to do that, to be able to make music. But taking students through the woods, of practice is an interesting walk. And it helps me to understand myself better as well. I believe it was Whitehead, the educational philosopher, who talked about, Alfred North Whitehead, I believe, about the romance period that you have when you start a new instrument. I see that with my string techniques people. So you're in this romance period. This is great. You're calling everybody you know. I just played hot cross buns. It's great. And then there's the work period, that extends for a long time, and it gets kind of dark in there. And that's what I call the jungle or the woods, and you got to come through the trees to the other side when you get the reward, that you actually have done it. And I think for our students, one thing that I need to be careful of is to make sure that they engage with setting goals that are monitored by me, that are small enough for them to be able to recognize that they achieved them. Because you can be doing several things quite well on the cello and still get a really bad outcome. But not recognizing that as a novice, you just think you're not progressing. So being able to be good observers of their own playing, to say, okay, I did this right. It's still not coming out, but that's because I'm hitting two strings at once. And once I take care of that, then I'll have a successful hot cross buns. So I think that's part of it. And in addition to that, I think we're entering a time in education where we're starting to look at process more and starting to engage the students in problem solving. And the journey for teachers is going to be in how to arrange what Duke calls strategic confusions for students, to be able to help them to go through the problem-solving process. And what I need to do as a teacher is to make sure the problem-solving is exactly at the level they need so that they can experience it. And so I think there's nothing more motivating than success.
Yeah, that's great.
And
it sounds like everything that you said was probably as applicable not just to the single cellist practicing in a practice room, but in terms of how you motivated your orchestras in public schools or community schools?
I think that would be the case, in that trying to get students to engage more in the problem solving. And in creating, one of the things I think we leave out is making sure that our students actually do have some kind of imagery going on of what they want to sound like. I think they play without that and simply accept what comes out of the instrument. And then that puts the instrument in charge, and we know what happens then.
That's a good turn of phrase, too. I like that. Well, now, what are some of your future research projects? What are some of your projects coming down the pike?
I want to take a good look at my string techniques class. Teaching string techniques gives me a great vantage point to record some data on students and their progress. And I want to look at just changing the format and perhaps having them switch instruments more often. And from that, I have been inspired by reading research in neurology about interleaved practice, or in cognition, I should say, rather than neurology. And interleaved practice says if you're going to teach a principle, you need to change things up more often. So my thought is to have students play primarily the string bass, but during their time, that's the 4 weeks that's set aside for string bass, they play viola occasionally too. So take what you just learned on the bass, put it on the viola, let's see what happens, and then go back. Now, the caution about that, about interleave practice, is that it's messy, and you don't get good return in the beginning, but that the learning rate later on, with other disciplines anyway, is said to be stronger, because you're teaching a principle as well as the individual differences.
Interesting. I'll have to keep an eye on how that goes. First thing that comes to mind is possible applications in things like teaching arranging class, where rather than when we're talking about writing for brass, that you're only thinking those thoughts, but that you're also tying into how you were thinking about strings or woodwinds when you learn those, so that you keep the principle as a active thread as much as possible.
And I wonder on the cello if we teach a thumb position at the same time we're teaching first position, things like that.
Definitely some advocates of that approach.
Yeah. Can we teach the geography of the instrument and the principles behind, the shrinking hand in the upper positions? Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. There's lots of potential to play with that. So I don't know but what the outcome will be, but that's why you do it.
Right. That's why it's called research.
Yeah.
What was the expression Dr. Duke used? Controlled chaos or?
Strategic confusions.
Strategic confusion.
Yeah. Strategic confusions. Yeah. Huh. Yeah. And that's interesting, to think about. Yeah. That was in one of his 2012 articles, I think. Yeah.
As many interesting uses of the language as Mrs. Young did, pretty much.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, not too much for the student to be able to get through to the other side of it. But you want to make them proud. Mm-hmm. It isn't enough for me to be proud of their accomplishments. They have to buy into it too.
Yes. Yeah, and that is a huge motivator.
Yeah. And I think that's the one I'm clinging to right now.
Yeah. Right. I like that. Well, Dr. Colprit, this has been really inspiring to me. I know it has been to the viewer as well. They should be just chock full of things in their mind to inspire them through not only the weekend of practice, but maybe for weeks to come. And thanks so much. And to everybody out there, happy practicing until I see you this time next Friday.